Best practices for hybrid lectures. So first question, what do I mean by a hybrid lecture? So a hybrid lecture is one of those where you are presenting to an in-person audience and you also are on Zoom and have a virtual audience at the same time. You'll also see this described as concurrent teaching if you look at this in the literature. So there are a couple of things we all should know about hybrid presentations. Number one, this is very difficult. Anything that you read says, even if you're a very experienced, very comfortable presenter, this is just very difficult to do. To be managing those two audiences simultaneously, equally, is very difficult for anyone to do. Secondly, be aware that we've had some variant of this in place for a long time. We have had lecture capture for a long time. The difference is chat. And so with us right now, it isn't that we've got people that are in the room and people who aren't in the room. It's that expectation that we are equally addressing those two separate populations that is what is making it so much more difficult for us right now. So what are some key concerns that people have about our doing these hybrid presentations? Well, the first is that you need to be aware that the students who are physically with you in the room, they just have an advantage. You can see them, you can tell more easily when they're confused, they probably feel freer to ask you questions, you can have more natural conversations as they can hear each other more readily. It's just a much more fluid and natural way for us to be part of a discussion that is helping our students understand things, and less of it just being a presentation that they're watching from a distance with which they cannot interact. We're sort of pretending right now that we can interact with that virtual audience much more than we can compared to what we can do with the students in the classroom with us. Another concern is that it's really easy to be distracted when you're online, and we all know this for ourselves. I took this series of pictures to show you what was there as I was creating this PowerPoint. So there's my computer, and it's on my desk, and there's 50 other things on my desk, all of which are possible distractors for me. And just to my right is a beautiful window that looks out onto a garden and out onto the street, and there's all sorts of fascinating things happening out there. And there's my dog, and he's just sitting waiting for me to be done, and once in a while he comes in and asks for pets. There's just all these ways that it's really easy for us to get disengaged. And even if you're engaged, it can be difficult to insert yourself into the real-time conversations that you're hearing the instructor have with the people who are in the room. So it's a very difficult thing to feel as engaged in the same way as you would if you were there. And it is just human nature that we're much more likely to be distracted when we're in that online environment. Another thing to consider is for the instructor, you're asking your brain to do stuff it just does not do well. You're asking your brain to be watching the students while you're speaking about something else. You're following what's on your PowerPoint. You're thinking about wondering why that student looks confused right now. What did you just say? Meanwhile, you're supposed to be following what's happening in the chat or answering questions that the students are just speaking to you from above. You don't even know who the student is. It's just a lot to be asking your brain to do. And frankly, it's not what our brains are built to do. So it isn't that you're a poor instructor at all. It's that you're a human being and we're just asking you to do things that human beings don't do particularly well. So what are best practices when you're giving a hybrid presentation? Well, the first one is to be really frank with the students about what is going to happen. So for me, I'm very frank with the students that you're going to have a better experience if you're in the room. I can see you if you're in the room. I can answer your questions more directly. I can reiterate things that it looks to me like you're confused, and so I'm going to choose to present that in a different way. You're just going to have a better experience if you're in the room. Don't be judgmental about the ones who aren't in the room. They probably have a really good reason why they're not in the room, but just be frank with them that you are probably not going to be able to give them the exact same experience you're giving to the students that are in the room. Second thing is try to keep everybody on track by making sure everybody's getting the same thing. So make sure everybody's got sort of an agenda. The first slide is going to be, here's what I'm going to talk about today. We're going to talk through a case, then we're going to talk about these steps, then we're going to revisit that case so everybody knows where we are. And give breaks during the presentation like you would anyway to ask for questions in the room and to also specifically ask for questions from the people who are present virtually. Another thing to do is to really consider ways to actively engage both the groups. So you're going to say, okay, I'm interested in how many of you have had a course in embryology before. If you're in the room, raise your hand. Okay, great. If you're on Zoom, put it in the chat. Okay, I need a minute to look at that. Okay, great. So it looks like overall, maybe 10% of you have had it, that sort of thing. If you're going to give people something to do, like you want them to do a think, pair, share, or whatever, you tell the people in the room, okay, turn to somebody, have this conversation for a minute. Zoom people, you're going into breakout rooms. And you can ask Zoom to do that for you automatically with X number of people through rooms. Things like that, just trying to keep everybody sort of doing the same thing at the same time. And then finally, take control of the chat function in Zoom. So you can say to the students, I'm not going to read the chat while I'm giving the lecture. That's not fair to everybody for me to be standing and reading the computer. So I'm not going to read the chat. I would encourage you to not use the chat for side conversations. I would rather you wait until I tell you it's time for questions, unmute your microphone, ask me that question. If you really feel like you can't do that, email it to me after the lecture. However you want to do it. That's how I do it. You can do it however you want to do it. But I think it is perfectly okay for you to let students know, no, you don't get to decide what's happening in the room. I'm deciding what's happening in the room, and that may very well include what's happening with chat in Zoom. Some people ask, well, how about if I have like a chat monitor? If it's somebody else's job to read the chat and then just feed me the questions. And for a time, that was the job of the tech student in the class. And now that has been removed from their job description because that was not fair to them. They're trying to learn this information. They should not be sitting there reading the chat for the instructor, especially because people sometimes have the bad habit of chatting in the chat where they're putting in like, oh, I never thought about that. I saw a case like that once. Oh, was that when you were in Florida? Yes, it was. I loved Florida. All of that stuff that they're reading is keeping them from learning what they're supposed to in the class. And so at this point, if you've got a resident or a TA or somebody who wants to read it for you, I guess you could do that. But please do not ask one of the DVM students to do that. That's not their job in your course. So what are the take-home points? Try to make sure both audiences know that you know they're there and how you're going to interact with them. And so make sure everybody knows what's going to happen that day. Make sure they're all doing the same activities. Make sure they know when they can ask you questions and how that is best done. And don't expect yourself to be able to do everything. I get a lot of questions from people who really feel like they're failing as teachers because they can't manage both of those populations. And you shouldn't expect that of yourself. It's just not practical. We're human beings. We can't do all of that. So set some boundaries that make sense for you. For example, I'm not going to read the chat. That's a boundary that I set. I'm just not going to, but I will pause and give everybody a chance to ask me questions, and I will answer the questions no matter where they come from. Maybe you allow them to submit things to you in a written response. Maybe you have some other mechanism that you can use to help them respond to you. But don't expect yourself to be able to manage both those populations well. We just can't. If you have any questions about hybrid presentations or any of the recommendations I've made here, you can contact me and the rest of the CVM Education Support Group at cvmces@umn.edu.